Goed, welkom allemaal. Dit zijn mijn laatste Nederlandse woorden. Omdat Sam komt uit Australië, dus we gaan het in het Engels doen. And I believe there are some people from abroad as well, from Germany and Belgium. So there you are. Welcome everybody to a masterclass with Sam, Audio-freq, which you all might know. This is more people than we expected. We expected about 50, so here we are, 110 people about. So my name is Michel. I teach at Pintago. Pintago is a school for electronic music. And every now and then we do masterclasses like this one, and well, we do different genres. I had some hardstyle students in the past. There are a few here, and they always ask me, how do you make that kick? And I don't know, because I'm not a hardstyle producer, and it's not something you can do like you can do. I mean, I produce techno myself, and if I wanted to do a hardstyle kick, it's not like, oh, I take a kick and I put a distortion and then I'm done, because, you know, then my hardstyle students, they always correct me and say, oh, well, it doesn't sound very good. And I know, because I'm not a natural, so that's why we invited Sam over to somebody who does it every day and who knows what's going on, because, well, you know, he releases on big labels. We said he releases on Scantrax. Doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So we got some angry emails about that. Sorry. When I get hardstyle students, they always ask me, like, how do you make that kick? And I always have the feeling that they want a really simple recipe, like, tell me the plugin I need to use, tell me the distortion I need to use, and I'll be done. And then I have a kick, and then I can move on. And the thing is, I went, for this masterclass, I went to the studio of Sam, and we talked for a few hours. And what I found out is that there's a lot of knowledge that you need to get before you can make that kick. It's not easy. It's really, really difficult. So there's no easy way about this. There are a lot of things you need to learn, and it'll probably take you a few years. So if you are busy with producing hardstyle, and you've been busy for half a year, and you can't get those kicks, don't worry. It's really not. It's probably not going to happen that fast. It can if you work on it for 8 hours a day, then maybe there's a lot of work going into that. So it's a real skill. So some people might say, like, hardstyle, simple music. Well, you know that, right? When I was talking with Sam, there are a few things that struck me, things that I think that are really important, and things that he told me are really important. For you to master, if you want to get a firm grasp on producing hardstyle kicks and hardstyle music in general. And the first is, and well, you'll see it in the masterclass of Sam as well. You need to be really aware of frequencies. You really need to know the spectrum inside out. You'll see Sam use this plugin as well. It's a spectrum analyzer. So, oof. Now there's a really simple sine tone, but this one, I mean, frequencies is, well, as you can see, they start at 20 hertz about, and they go on to 20K, 20 kilohertz. That's the range of the human hearing, and that's where everything happens. But you need to know where 200 hertz is and how it sounds. You need to know what 600 hertz does. And Sam, 700 hertz is important, right? Yeah. Yeah, he told me, yeah, that's the club frequency you need to know. So you need to know what it sounds like, 700 hertz. What does it mean to boost 700 hertz on a kick? What does it mean to take out 200 hertz? And you really have to get a feeling for that. So you need to play with EQs, because that's where you shape the sound with. Another thing that's important, of course, is distortion. And what I'll show you is what this distortion does. For instance, this is a really simple sine tone. And I'll take a different spectrum analyzer, Ableton's. There you go. It's a bit smaller. So what you see here is a sine tone, and a sine tone has just one so-called overtone. That's it. There you go. And now see what happens when I apply distortion to this. And I'll just grab an Ableton distortion. And as you will see, what gets produced by the distortion is overtones. And every distortion has its own overtones. So the overtone structure, that's what defines a distortion. Let us see. You see, you get all these overtones, and they're all different for every distortion. Every distortion has its sound. So Sam will show you some plugins he uses as well. What's really funny is that one of the most important distortions in hardstyle, I get the feeling, is the clip distortion in Logic. So while most of the people are working in Cubase, they always have Logic running alongside for the clip distortion. And that's because it has this special sound. At least that's what I was told by Sam. So you really have to get a feeling for what distortion does, how it sounds. And of course, once you distort the sound, then you can shape it with EQ. So let me get an EQ. And the thing is, I'm showing this in Ableton, but it doesn't really matter what program you use. You need to feel comfortable with it. So that's the most important thing. And Sam uses 3 or 4 programs as well. So take the best out of everything. But the thing is, now once you have all the overtones, what you can do then is shape it with an EQ. And with an EQ, there are a few things you need to know. Like you have several bands, and of these bands you can, you can of course boost them, cut them. And my experience is the more experience you get with using EQ, the more you start to cut. When you start out, it's usually curves like this. That's what I see with a lot of students. Like, yeah, I need to pump up this sound a bit. And then as you move along and get more experience, what you'll see is that you'll really freak out if you start using these EQ curves. You really feel bad about it, like, oh, what did I do? It's too much. But that's when you're really experienced. So really, I mean, 2 or 3 dB of gain on a certain frequency can really go a long way if you know what you're doing. And if you're looking for a really specific sound. So what can you do with EQ? It's, well, usually with these kind of EQs, they're called parametric EQs, you can do 3 things, like the gain, the frequency, and something called the Q or the bandwidth. So high Q is low bandwidth, and that you can use to shape your sound. There are usually also different types of filters. So this is called a bell filter, and a bell filter because it looks like a bell, of course. And then there's a filter, this one, it's called a shelving filter. And a shelving filter, you can make frequencies below a certain frequency softer or louder. Or if you use the other bell, the shelving filter, this one, you could make them louder or softer above a certain frequency. And there's also filters. So this is a low-pass filter or a high-pass filter. And what struck me when I was at Sam's studio is that there's not that much low in low frequencies in hardstyle. It's and I think that's something that goes for club music in general. I'm amazed at how little low you have to put in there to get this really big sound. Of course, there has to be a low sound, but usually people think, and maybe Sam can correct me if he thinks I'm wrong, people usually think, oh, I make club music, and in a club, the bass is really banging, so I need to put a lot of bass in there. But the thing is, bass eats up all the energy. If you look at the spectrum, all the energy is down there. So if you cut that to the minimum amount of bass possible, then your sound can be much louder and much more convincing. So that's something I found out for myself, and I talked to Sam, and I talked to another dubstep producer. He's in the room back there. We'll have a masterclass with him next month. He told me the same thing. Even in dubstep, which is bass music, he cuts out all the bass, or, well, just enough bass to get the impression that there's really big bass, but it's not there. So filters are your best friend as well. So, yeah, what we'll do, this rounds off my, this is the end of my introduction.
Goedemorgen allemaal. Ik ben Sam, and that concludes my Dutch. Look, I guess, yeah, we're all here for one thing and one sound, which is pretty unique. You know, most people come to a masterclass on how to manipulate sounds, how to learn to write music, which is a very broad subject, but here it's very specific, which is very, very unique. But let me explain a little bit more about myself, my background, how I came across what we're all here for, and then we'll go into a little bit of the theory of kick drums, because I think that's very important. We're going to talk about, the theory, the distortion, how I come across the distortion, how I manipulate distortion, and then afterwards, in the second half, we'll go into the practical, breakdown, a project that I'm working on, which I think is kind of exciting because it's not a complete one. I've got some complete kicks here, but the actual project of what I've done. The plugins that I use, as well as just like what I listen for and what I look for. I think it's more important that you guys learn how to think and how to listen, not just a bunch of settings of like, okay, cool, this gives me that result. Because at the end of the day, times change, sounds change, but if you've got a little bit of a knowledge on how to manipulate sound, then you'll be able to move with that time. And let's face it, we're here for music and music changes, so let's get into it. But look, my name is Sam. I come originally from Australia, and I discovered hard dance music way back in the 90s. I discovered it through, just listening to the radio. It was more like a UK-based happy hardcore that I grew up listening to. Well, there's a lot of Dutch stuff as well. And in about 2007, I moved to the UK, just mainly for production. And I did a lot of different styles of music. I haven't always done just one style of music. I've done, hip-hop. I've done drum and bass. I've done a little bit of trance and house. And throughout these experiences, I've learned a lot of things of just production in general, which I think helps with hardstyle. But also learning about, the sounds that are in hardstyle as well. And it wasn't until about 2008 when I just randomly came across the Project One album from Headhunters and Wildstyles, where I listened to it and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. It's very unique. It's very different. It wasn't anything like that I heard before. Growing up listening to like drum and bass or UK rave music, you don't really have the same kind of sounds. Anyway, through that sort of production journey, when I discovered hardstyle, I started doing some other things like, writing music for a Burger King commercial. Actually, it was pressed on a CD as part of like a Happy Meal. It was their equivalent of a Happy Meal, and there was like 1.5 million of those given away out in the States, which is kind of cool. That's pretty awesome. But I've also done scores for radio beds and other things as well. So I'm a very varied producer, and what I'm going to try and do is instill some of the knowledge that I've picked up along the way into how I approach this sound, into the hardstyle kick, and how I approach hardstyle, so that you guys can have a better understanding of how it all works. But basically, in case you don't already know, what is a hardstyle kick? Well, it's that big bong, bong, bong sound. I'll play you an example that I've got that we know as the hardstyle kick. So here we go. Here's one that I've used before, and apparently in hardstyle you can't use it more than once in a track, but whatever. Okay, let's give it a bit more juice, That's what we're here for. And it's a really, really unique sound in the regard that it is actually made up of very many different elements, not just a simple bong. You're never going to get that just out of one thing or one setting. Well, what I usually do, and where it came from, is kind of like tracking the history of dance music. Dance music sort of like popped up in the 80s with like old drum machines and stuff, and it wasn't until like the Dutch hardcore scene that they started using a 909. It's a very famous drum machine, and started distorting it, which gave us the very basis of this sound. The electronic drum machine gives us a sort of like a pop, pop, pop sort of a sound that has been used, in club music, in trance, and even in other genres like dubstep and drum and bass. But it's different to an acoustic kick drum because an acoustic kick drum is built differently. A drum machine, what it does is it uses filters and resonant filters to try and generate an almost sine tone, whereas an acoustic drum machine is basically a wooden thing hitting a plastic skin in a wooden barrel, and that kind of resonates. The other thing that is different as well is that electronic kicks will sweep down. They'll start at a high frequency and then go down to a low frequency. Usually with acoustic kick drums, when you hit it, it's got a specific tone. You don't even realize it right away, but it has something there. And it's tuned. You can tune the kick drum a little bit easier than you can with, say, for instance, a drum machine. Yes, you have the pitch on the 909. You might have it on a different thing, like if you use microtonic. Some people use microtonic for their kicks. You can pitch that pretty easily, but it's very different to an acoustic kick drum. So we're not going to really go into those today. We don't need to. Look, there is some debate where the first hardstyle kick came from. It's pretty interesting because, Dutch hardcore being around for, 20, maybe 25 years, people kind of evolved with it and they started taking different influences from where hardstyle came from. I mean, hardstyle was sort of born around 2000, 2001 with influences from techno, from hard house, and a little bit from jump style as well. And sort of this combination and people and producers working to put new sounds, put new influences at the time together resulted in this hardstyle kick. And the first one, like going through research, the first modern kick actually comes from a track from the Donkey Rollers. I think it was released in 2005, and it's called Followers. I'll play you the kick. It's kind of towards the end of the track. So that's the kind of older style that we had before the giant kick, and then I'll take it to the end. So it's not actually a new sound. It's been around for maybe 7 years. And I don't know, who the genius was that decided to sculpt this and distort this in such a way. But that is the basis of our sound, and that's what we're here for. So it's pretty unique. I'm going to show you some examples as well of like the evolution of this kick. So we've heard this track, which is from 2005. We've got another very famous style of hardstyle kick here from the Headhunters remix of Rate Reducer. So. A lot of heads nodding there, recognizing that. Which I believe this actually came from a sample of a hardcore track. But this goes to show that a lot of this influence comes from Dutch hardcore, which is, it's a whole other entity in itself. Regardless, through this evolution, what we've done is, tweaked it a little bit more, kind of reverse engineered the sound and tried to get something similar. And I'll play you some modern kicks that I've done and from other tracks of like, how the sound goes for. So, that one's nice and clean by itself. It's a little bit more tonal, up higher. It's kind of a really new school type one. And then we've got, I think, a dirtier one here. It's a quieter one that I'm still working on. Okay. So look, Michelle was talking about distortion. What is distortion? How does it work? Well, think of it this way. Distortion is kind of like this impassable line for the audio signal, like this, on the top, on the bottom. And when the signal gets a little bit too much, it doesn't go over that. It just kind of gets cut off. And depending how that gets cut off really depends on the sound that you get out of it. On some distortion units, they might smooth it a little bit and use like really cool maths to sort of like get it so it doesn't quite reach there. Other distortion units will get it and it'll hit that line, then bounce back a little bit, and then go back over it. It's really quite clever how it works. And if you look at it through an oscilloscope, it can be really, really interesting. I don't know. I'm a nerd. I really get into that. It's just like, okay, yeah. But this all affects the sound, and this is why every distortion unit is different, and every distortion plugin is different. If you use a hardware distortion, it's going to do that with vowels. It's going to use nonlinear maths to do that, to distort the signal. And if you use a plugin, sometimes they might add some little differences from the top and the bottom, and it might not be the same. And that's why I prefer to use standard plugins from Logic rather than other plugins, because it gives me a particular sound. And at the end of the day, you can try and find what works for you, but I do it this way because I found that this, in the end, does work for me, and it gives me the sound that I want, and that's what we're about. The other thing that is very, very, very important is an equalizer. Now, Michelle was talking about being very subtle sometimes when you're a bit more experienced with EQ. That is very true, especially when you're mixing down tracks and you're trying to get a good sound. But with hardstyle, we kind of take a very liberal use for the EQ. We kind of go to the extreme. What we do instead, when we distort something, that we then boost by savage amounts. I'm talking 10 to 15 decibels to really get a resonant tone out of the sound that we just distorted, and then we distort that further so we can get some more resonance going backwards and forwards. Now, the other thing is, like I talked about how we had a limit like this for distortion. Well, the thing is, when we have lower frequencies and a lot of low frequencies, they're going to get pushed up like this, and it's going to get to a point where you can't really distort anymore, and it's just going to sound like crap. So what we do is we actually take out low frequencies, so that way we can make some more room for the frequencies that we boost before when trying to resonate. So it's quite interesting, because then different distortion units will then behave differently when you take out low, when you high pass a little bit, and so on and so forth. And I know that kick drums, especially like some of the newer ones that we've been hearing, are really bass heavy. But the thing is, when you distort something and you really want to get those tones out of it, take out a little bass before distortion and you put in some bass afterwards, and hey, you get everything that you want. You get a really distorted signal and you get the low end in that as well. So, okay, a kick drum. I said it was made up of different sounds. What are the sounds that are made up in it? Well, I like to break it down into 3 different sections. The first section is the immediate thing that you hear, the punch. Very important. It's about 50 milliseconds long, can be a little bit longer. And then after that we have the tail, which I then break up into different subsections. You want to write this down. If you can, write it down. So we've got the punch, about 50 milliseconds long, and then after that, for the rest of the kick, is a tail, and that's separated up into what I call the sub, and then the character that goes over the top of that. Now, with distortion, what we can do is we'll try and get that character by resonating, by boosting in certain regions, and then we can try and put in the low end by then EQing the bass after we've distorted it. Regardless, look, the first 50 milliseconds is the punch, and afterwards we have the tail. And what I like to do as well is to try and EQ different kicks if I go to sample something to try and learn how they sound. What I'll do is maybe in the break try and get this working. Well, but actually, let's see if we can listen to. This is one that I've sampled from the picture. Excellent. So I'll just loop this, and we'll break this up. If I shorten this here, that's our punch. And afterwards, if you'll ignore the click, that's our tail. And it's not necessarily made from the same sound. Actually, the punch is, a lot of things layered together. And then the tail itself is something else completely. It usually comes from our 909 kick. And what we use to generate, more often than not, from different producers that I've worked with, I've learned that they use a plugin, a 909 emulation called Drumazon. It's from a Polish company called D16. I prefer to use something else, actually, but the end result is still the same. It's kind of a 909 sounding kick. Okay. Okay. Now, the other thing that we use to try and make the kick sound a little bit more than just, getting a tone and distorting it is reverb. And I see a lot of people sort of just went, what? Reverb? Yeah, reverb is used because, thanks man, thanks Logic. Because we can use it for reflecting sounds, and that's making a sound a little bit bigger, and then if we distort that, all those millions of reflections that are generated using reverb can then make the sound even more distorted. We use that a lot just to give it a sense of space. If we use it earlier on in the chain before distortion, it's going to sound really aggressive. Some of those industrial hardcore kicks, a lot of those use reverb early on in their process to make it sound really aggressive. And then if you want to get a bigger sounding kick, you run it really clean. But then towards the end, what we can do is then just, after say limiting and compressing your EQ, you're kind of done with the distortion, you're towards the end of the chain. You put a little bit of reverb and it can make it sound a lot bigger, it can make it sound a lot fatter. It's a cool thing that we picked up. I'm trying to think how I learned it off. Headhunters showed me that one. So it goes a long way. Reverb goes really a long way when it comes to making your sound and making your kick sound a lot more distorted and a lot bigger. Now, the other thing is as well, a tail is not just a static sound. It's not just a buzz. You can't get a synth and just generate that. I've tried. Put it simply, I've tried and it doesn't work. What we need to do is, once we go through distorting the kick, we need to give it a little bit of movement. And what we can do with that is by using an EQ. We can use, say, for instance, a bandpass filter with an envelope, so it goes, sweep. We're going for that wow sound that you hear. That is usually made from an EQ that's moving sort of down between some of the frequency ranges, and we'll go into that in a little bit. Okay, so the process of making a kick, I've talked about, we're distorting a sound, we're distorting a 909 sound. So let me open up. Let me open up what I used to start off with. This is Tremor. I don't know if it comes up completely on the screen. It's a little bit smaller resolution. sorry, not tremor, drummer's on. I normally use tremor, but for some reason that doesn't want to install or whatever. But regardless, this is a very, very simple way to generate your sound. So if we listen to it by itself, that's not been distorted, not been affected. You can hear this. This is what we start off with. Very basic sound, different to an acoustic kick drum. And if you analyze it, it's not even a sine sweep. It's actually a triangle wave. That's important because different waves have different harmonics in different orders. A saw wave has all the harmonics going from start to finish, and they're not just even ones, not just odd ones. And when I say even and odd harmonics, what I mean is that there's a fundamental frequency, let's say 55 hertz, and then you'll times that to get the rest of the sound. So 55 hertz, and then you'll get your second harmonic, which would be 110, and then further up, I don't know the rest of the maths. I need a calculator for that. But then you calculate that, and the even numbers, so you times it by an even number, will be even harmonics. The odd ones will be odd harmonics. A square wave actually has the fundamental frequency and then odd harmonics after that. And that's important as well in a kick drum because depending on the different ratios that you have your harmonics will depend on the sound of your kick drum as well. It can sound a little bit more aggressive. It can sound a little bit more open and happy. That's got to do with the ratio of how these harmonics are generated, which comes ultimately from the distortion. Okay. So this is the sound that we start off with. It's a really, really simple sound. And then what we'll do afterwards, and I'll show you my chain, because this is important, is that we start affecting it right away. We start with the clip distortion, which I'll bring up. Then a whole bunch of EQ, reverb, a little bit of compression stuff. All the plugins that I've used here are the Logic plugins. And I do this every time, actually. And part of it is because it's a challenge. The other part is because, well, like as I said before, different distortion units work in different ways and don't quite give me the sound that I want. Say, for instance, like I find that like the Camel distortions are usually a little bit unstable. They introduce strange sort of noises, and they calculate the maths a little bit weird, and you get all these strange things that you don't really want in a kick. Another distortion that I sometimes use, not in this particular case, is the isotope trash. And the reason being is because when you use it to clip a signal, it'll just chop things off really evenly. It won't introduce any other fancy maths. It's not going to try and fold it over. And it's good for the sound of the kick because sometimes you just want that really clean distortion. You don't want anything else. But look, a lot of people wonder, okay, why the clip distortion? Why can't we use this with anything else? Why doesn't it exist on other platforms or whatever? Well, I can't tell you why it doesn't exist. I'm not a software developer. It's just in Logic, and that's how they've done it. But it's very unique in the way because it doesn't just distort a signal. Actually, before this, on this tone section that you'll see up over here, is actually a 6 dB high-pass filter. So it's going to remove some of the bass frequencies that go into the distortion unit. The drive is pretty much like an input gain, how much signal you're going to send into this distortion unit. The clip filter here over here is just another filter that comes right after the unit itself. And the symmetry is actually kind of interesting. With distortion, you know how I talked about these two impassable lines? Well, basically what a symmetry does is kind of like move these lines up and down like this. And if you've ever looked at a waveform, if you've ever looked at like a kick drum just sort of like in a software editor, a sound editor, sorry, you'll see that there's this line kind of in the middle of where things always are, and there's sort of like a balance. Everything's kind of like a little bit above, a little bit below, and it always returns to zero, which is what that line is. What symmetry does is actually changes that. It keeps the line there, but then, pushes one of these distortion bars up, if you could call it a distortion bar, and that will change the sound, how it works. It changes how the harmonics are calculated. It changes the room that you have to distort as well. It's kind of important. The symmetry isn't always here at 80. It's kind of like a guess thing that you do. But that's really important as well, and which is another reason why different distortion units work differently. Like a Trash, for example, doesn't let you have that. It has its distortion bars here. different versions of, I think Trash 2 allows you to try and manipulate this. It's not as good. But the Camel Fat, the Camel Crushers, the Om sides don't really give you this flexibility, and this is very, very important for the generation of sound and the generation of the distortion that we have. We have a mix here as well, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's the mix between the undistorted signal and the distorted signal, and this becomes very handy because sometimes you want to retain some of the low frequencies in the original signal because we're going to keep on distorting that later on. This low-pass filter is basically a filter here that goes on the distorted signal, and then over here we have this sort of high shelving frequency here, which I pretty much just use as a gain. Some people sort of set this frequency here to sort of shelve above. I've seen people using it around 150 hertz. But I kind of keep it at the bottom because it helps me use that as a gain control. But if I load up this first distortion unit here on Drummers On, we can start hearing what it does right away. Those of you who are into early rave will recognize this as like, you're pretty much there for early rave. And to be fair, like, being back in the 90s, they had limited resources, limited computer power, so, they didn't really need to distort that much, and let's face it, not many people were pushing the boundaries back then. That was kind of it. This is kind of the boundary. But like, I'll play through and tweak some of the settings so you can hear what this thing does. Take the tone down. In this case, it doesn't do so much. Take the symmetry. You start hearing there's a slightly different tone there. If I load up span, which I think is very important, you can see that we have our fundamental frequency here, where the tuning is of the low kick. And all these other little ones that are coming across. If I start playing with the symmetry, some of these will come up in different orders. And ultimately, this is very important, because as you distort later on, the ratio of these harmonics and these different overtones are going to come out and really affect the sound of your kick drum. Now, the other thing that I think is really important as well when you start distorting and you start EQing is to put on another distortion right after the EQ. And the reason being is because when you start distorting something and then EQing it, you're going to get these huge boosts. As you can see, I'm doing some boosts here by 11 dB, and that's a massive amount. Unless you're doing something creatively, like a hardstyle kick, boosting by these kind of amounts is just kind of like unheard of. Like, you wouldn't do this on a lead. You wouldn't do this really on a snare drum or try to fix something in the mix. This is a creative and a very liberal use of EQ. So as I bypass this, I'm just going to take these other bands off because I'm going to show you later what they do. I'm going to put on another distortion unit, and I'm going to load up this big crusher later on in the chain. And the reason why I've loaded this up is basically it's a really simple clipper. What I mean by clipper is, our two impassable boundaries. It just does it. Doesn't do any fancy maths, and that's it. Like, I'm not changing any of like the downsampling resolution or anything like that. It's not really going to affect the sound except for pretty much just cut it off where it is. But it's very important to have a distortion unit loaded after your kick drum, because otherwise, you're going to have wild frequencies everywhere. If you've got it turned up and you're sitting at home and you're boosting by 11 dB, man, your ears are going to pop, and no one wants that. I don't know about you, no one wants that. So, load up a bit crusher right after the distortion unit, or any other distortion unit, and you can start boosting things, and things are going to be tamed right away. What I think is really important as well is boosting here at these resonant frequencies. If you can, write that down, take a photo, do something. This is important because, as Michelle said, this is what I call like the club region or the club frequency. This is where most hardstyle kicks have their power. Somewhere in the 90s, somewhere discovered that if they overdrive, if they start pushing the mid frequencies, they can get more distortion and more tone, and their kicks sound more aggressive. I don't know who it was, but someone discovered it, and yeah, it's magic. It's fantastic. So yeah, we'll play this again. And you can hear there's a very defined tone. like I said, this is really important because this is the basis of what we're going to keep on doing. We're going to keep on pushing these frequencies. We're going to keep on distorting, and we need room. Now, because we need room, on this side, because we need room, like I said before, we're going to need to take out some low frequencies as well so that we can keep on distorting and keep on manipulating our signal. So I've got a low shelf filter here at around 80 hertz. It doesn't need to be there. It can be lower. This is just something that I've tweaked in this project. So there's not much low in there. That's fine. That's totally okay because we're going to keep on distorting that. I'm going to load up another clip distortion here. And because I've taken out those low frequencies, it starts to get more distorted. If I put those low frequencies back in, we're not going to get the same kind of a sound. Yeah. So this is the low frequencies out. Terrible. Horrible. And if you keep on distorting, if you keep on driving the input gain, you're not actually going to get a better sound. That's the way distortion is. We've got two impassable boundaries. That's it. That's the absolute limit of where we can take things. So we need to make some room. We'll make some room, take out some low frequencies. Listen to that. Huge difference. And this is really important that as we keep on distorting and resonating, that we start making room so we can keep on distorting. That's just how it works, you know. When you start filling your house full of crap, you know, you're eventually going to run out of room, so then you get rid of the old crap, and then you put in new stuff. So that's just how it is. What I think is really important as well is that as we change the symmetry for sounds, as we change the symmetry in the distortion, so that's the up and down of where these distortion things are, we can actually use like a high-pass filter to try and rectify the signal. Now, what I mean by that is, if we've got like a symmetry where it's kind of like up here and our line is normally here, and the signal's all over the place, we can use a high-pass filter to try and set that back to normal. I don't know the maths for this. I just know that it works. However, allow me to demonstrate just here in between distortion units, or like how it changes the sound. Now this is kind of like the same function as what this tone does here. I've done it a little bit more savage in this particular case. But the idea is that while we've got like a signal that used to be all the way up here, I put a filter just before the distortion, so it kind of sets the boundaries back down here again, and then we can distort it further. But as you can see here, with these three basic plugins, the inbuilt logic ones, I've already kind of got, well, let's be honest, it's about a quarter of the way there. But having said that, we can start introducing separate elements and refining and reprocessing that sound so that we can get a little bit further and we can keep on going. Reverb, as I talked about before, can go anywhere in the chain. In this particular case, I've introduced it a little bit before the second distortion. So not right at the start, because if I did it right at the start, it's going to sound horrible, in my very personal opinion. It's going to sound a little bit horrible. So here's what it's like when I start putting in a little bit of reverb. So it's a really, really short reverb, but all these reflections that are generated throughout this reverb can help distort the signal a little bit further and make it sound just a little bit more crunchy. This is really important because a kick, as I said before, is a collection of sounds, but it's also a very refined sound. You want a bit of crunch so it cuts through in the mix. You want those 700 hertz so it really sounds massive on a club system. Nobody wants this an all bass. That's just not how it works. If you want to listen to more bassy music, that's fine. That's not hating, but that's just not what a hardstyle kick is. We're a quarter of the way there. If I introduce this same, in fact, I'm going to put in another reverb. I'm going to put it right after here on Dramazon. Maybe about here. And I'm going to show you what it does when I put it way before. In this particular case, it doesn't sound so good. That's fine. It's not a problem because a lot of this is experimentation. Regardless, still using reverb to distort your signal or to add in more information to distort is really important. Okay, so, like I said before, we're always about boosting here, adding information before distortion, and then cutting out some low end so we can distort that signal a little bit further. Now, to get that movement in the tail, which I think is really important, because right now it's just about, which is fine, but it's still not moving enough. What I like to do is I put in a little bit of a filter envelope. So I use the Logic's auto filter in here. And the way that I use it is basically it's kind of boosting around, I think 600 hertz, and then just goes. It's really simple, but it adds a little bit more character, and a little bit more movement to the sound. So if we look on our scope, on our span, what this is doing is just basically doing a little sweep from around here further down. And that's important because, yeah, it makes your kick sound a little bit more interesting and sound a little bit bigger. And if we distort that signal a little bit further, it just adds movement. And movement is extremely important. If I exaggerate this, you can hear exactly what I'm talking about. For those that listen to Zartox's style of hardstyle, this is what he does. You know, here's kind of a flavor, a lot of movement in the tail, and personally, I'm a huge fan of it. As we go and keep on distorting and resonating and distorting and resonating, you know, we'll get to a point where we just start to refine sounds and need to refine these sounds. So, using using a specialist sort of like top and tail of the EQ, we can kind of further get that along so that when we bounce this down, and which is part of the process, we never keep this live. In a track, we'll bounce this, have a project, and then export that out, and then reprocess that further, so then we'll have a final wave file, or AIF file, whatever you want to call it, a final sample that we can put into our project, because you can't keep this live. You can't pitch this up and down. You can't really do that much with a kick like this inside a project. So we'll start to refine this and start to go a little bit further. Adding some more low end as we see fit, adding some more high end, adding a little bit more fuzz and crunch. In this particular case, I felt the need to add a little bit more mid-range, lower mid frequencies over here. Take this off. Once again, this adds a little bit more movement down to the sound. But this is a basic sort of project and process that I go through as I'm building a kick. Now, I think something that is really important when you're actually making a kick drum is knowing where to start with and what frequencies to start with. So with Drumazone, or if you use Microtonic, I mean, I would recommend to use Drumazone, or I use Tremor, which is very similar to this, is to start at lower frequencies like a G, like a G sharp, like an F or an F sharp. Around those are really good kick frequencies to have your kick, because then you want to pitch it up. Pitching down doesn't seem to work too well with the hardstyle kick. If you were to generate something at A, so the fundamental frequency is at 55 hertz, and then you take it down, it doesn't sound quite right. And this is just the voice of experience talking. It just doesn't sound, I'm sorry, like it just doesn't work. However, if you were to generate something around like a G, I can't remember the frequency off the top of my head, or a G sharp, that's pretty good. It's a pretty all-round frequency. You can take it up, you can take it higher, but we don't really pitch it as you're working. You sort of like finish the kick, and then you pitch it after you've done everything. So, whoa, that's nice. That's a, oh. Well, the worst part about it is I paid for it, and it's just been stupid. Regardless, I like to generate my stuff around G. It's a it's a nice all-around frequency that I was talking about. And one of the reasons that I use this particular plugin, Tremor, is because I have the ability to know exactly where I'm taking it up and down. You'll see that it tells me the frequency, it tells me the note, whereas Drummers On doesn't give me that kind of a flexibility. But if we listen to it, say for instance a kick in G, it's a little bit long there. I'll see if I can turn that down. It has its own character, and when you start boosting and removing and distorting frequencies, certain kicks are going to sound better when you boost certain frequencies, and that's just the nature of it. You know, if you start boosting at 700 hertz and then distorting that, and then your kick ends up like as you're tweaking it, you're like, oh, now I'm going to take it down to F. You know, that frequency might not be so relevant anymore. It may be the reverse. It might be even better. You know, if we take this, what used to be down in G, we'll take it down to, say, for instance, F. It's a little bit heavier, and obviously the lower the frequencies go on the spectrum, the heavier the kick will sound. In this particular case, though, it doesn't sound quite right, so we'll leave that for the time being. But I think it's very important also to, when you're building a kick, try and get your fundamental tone in key, because when you're going to be working with that later on, and if you're going to be pitching it up and down, if you're going to keep it in the same original key that you've been working on, then it's going to sound out of tune if you're working your track in a different key. It's very important that, okay, I'm going to generate this and try and get it as close to a proper note frequency as possible, because let's say we're working in G, our track is in G, that we're working, we've got our screeches, we've got our melody, everything's awesome, we input our kick drum, and it's just a little bit sharp, so it's a little bit like in G and then 20% a little bit too high, it's not going to sound right, and it's just not going to work right. Or if it's a little bit too low, and it's a lot easier to tweak that process before you do everything, rather than, okay, I've made my kick, I've distorted everything, sweet, awesome, fantastic, load it in, wait, it's not right, it's not there. No, that's the painstaking process. You're better off right at the beginning, starting off with a good sound, getting it at the right frequency that you need to get it at. So at a whole note, something like 55 hertz is A. I'm trying to think what is lower. Maybe 49 hertz is G. And getting it around there to start off with makes a huge difference, and it saves you a lot of heartache down the line when you're trying to pitch things left, right, and center. Let's try and think of where we need to go. Some people, what they do is, and I've seen Wildstyles do this actually. He recorded a kick drum straight out of a 909 rather than distorting it, saying that okay, the harmonics in this sound a little bit better, a little bit fatter, a little bit warmer because it's the original unit rather than a software version. And to a certain degree, that he's right. Like the actual 909 doesn't generate its sound. Just using a triangle wave, I'm going to sweep. It uses a couple of really resonant filters, and because they're analog filters, they have a different sound to them. You don't need to do this. You can use the Drummers On, but if you're feeling brave and you really want extra harmonics and stuff, by all means, spend $1,000, get a 909, and tweak away. Hey, more power to you, but you don't necessarily need to do this. I would recommend just using a software synth to generate the sounds that you need. Another thing that's really important, that Michelle sort of talked about, is I always use Span, and I always keep it open on a separate sort of screen. I don't really work on my laptop, so I don't kind of have it there, and as you can see, there's not much real estate. But this gives you a little bit of a guide as to where you need to distort things, and where there's room and where there isn't room, or when you've done a little bit too much. And the other thing that helps is that when you're learning and listening to another kick drum, you can actually just watch this and say, oh, okay, so that's what they're doing there. Using spectrum analyzers is a tool that really will save you a lot of heartache. Say, for instance, you're listening on a system that you've never really listened to before. You're at your mates, you've got a kick, you think it's fantastic, and you're like, oh, okay, I don't know. Whereas if you look at a spectrum analyzer, that's going to tell you the truth. No matter what, no matter the listening position, no matter what speakers you're using. And it can give you a guide of when enough is enough and when too much is too much. I'm going to load in a kick, actually. I'm going to look at it through the spectrum analyzer so we can see where things can go and how it can fit. What? Oh. Oops. See if these are okay. Okay. As we can see here, our 600 to about 1K, there's a huge boost there. There's a lot of action that's happening, of course, down at the low frequencies. This frequency over here is actually quite interesting. And the reason why it's interesting because it's just sort of standing out above everything else, especially the harmonics that are next to it. I can't tell you why he did this, but what I can tell you is the effect that it has on lower systems, and especially the crappy club systems. I mean, hardstyle isn't always, played in your car where it's, fantastic with a gigantic subwoofer. It's not always played at gigantic festivals where they've got subwoofers that can play down to 20 hertz. It's not the case. Often there are environments and situations where this kind of music will be played on less than optimal club systems. But a lot of those will still reproduce frequencies not as far down as 20 hertz, but they'll emphasize, say, for instance, the 100 hertz area, so from 100 to 200 hertz. What this kick does is really emphasizes a lot of energy in that region. So if you're listening in a not so good environment, in a not so great club, this is still going to sound like a huge kick. I mean, let's face it, it sounds huge anyway. But if we start taking out some of the low frequencies, so let's take out, let's see, it was more resonant around, like it was huge around 40 hertz. We take away, it still sounds really big, and it still sounds like it's got a lot of heaviness to it. And this kind of goes on to what I was saying before, if the kick is divided up into 3 different sections, your punch, then your tail, and then thanks, drummer. Thank you. Thanks. I got in touch with the developers and they haven't got back to me. But if you divide your kick up into the 3 different sections, and then really focus on those sections and getting the most out of those sections, you'll come out with a fantastic sounding kick. If we just chop off the punch, and we start listening to, say, for instance, the character. What I define as a character is kind of like, the tail part and then high passing around, say, 250, even up to 300 hertz. And if you'll excuse the little click there, you can really hear that, ow, ow, ow. It's really aggressive, really distorted. Cool, fantastic, awesome. We love that, we want that. If we start low passing, so taking out the highs, do a more severe filter, and then going back to where we were, so about 300 hertz, we can really listen to the sub of the tail. Huge, massive. A lot of that is in part due to this frequency over here. So even when we take out the really low frequencies, it still sounds huge. Now these are things that I listen for and that I look out for every time I go to start making a kick. Listening for the more resonant frequencies, trying to think of like, okay, how is it going to sound in a crappier system? Is it big enough? Do I need a little bit more reverb? It's important to realize and to know these things because over time, as you practice, as you develop your ears more, you'll be able to notice right away when you start building the kick.
Sam, is it okay to
Sure? Absolutely, yeah, okay. Well, does anyone have any questions so far? Go for it.
Well, if you compress with the kick, and what is the result when you go to master? Because you master your own.
Yeah, I master my own tracks, yeah.
Compress, and how does it work together? You must compress low.
Well, primarily, like, I don't use that much compression when I make my kick. I use it in a creative way, and I'll show you when we come back. But the reason why I do that is because I want to make more room for more signal to be distorted. And what I do is I put a compressor before a distortion unit. I set the attack to around 50 milliseconds. So that's the first little bit. The punch is going to go through the compression unit, and then the compression is going to kick in for the rest of that, so the tail actually becomes less distorted. And what I do then is then gain that up, so that when it goes into the distortion unit, my punch, which hasn't been affected by the compression just yet, gets really distorted. And the tail, not so much. And that's how I use compression for a kick. I find that anything else, like if I do it right afterwards, it doesn't help, man. Like that's just not how I do it, and I haven't really found a way to use compression that much to sort of tame a sound. No, I use it maybe, yeah, like I said, just for a little bit for creative use to get a little bit more distortion out of it, not really in the sense of like getting a little bit more punch or anything, if that's what you mean.
But it can be not so good with the mastering if you compress before you master.
No, but I use this like when I'm distorting, not necessarily in the track before I'm compressing. And I guess the compression that you're talking about sounds like it's more on the whole track itself rather than on the kick. Because if it's on the kick, then it's not really going to affect things like the vocals, the leads, and the overall balance of the mix. So yeah, look, to sum that up and to answer very quickly, I don't use that much compression on the kick. I don't think it's necessarily needed because of the amount of distortion that's going through. You don't really, yeah, like, I mean, compression traditionally is used to sort of tame a signal and to sort of even things out a little bit. When you're distorting heavily, like, I mean, the first unit that I was using was like 50 decibels of gain. That's a lot. When you're distorting a lot, you don't really need to compress so much, especially if you're distorting after EQ as well, because it's just, the signal doesn't need to. It's already like this. I mean, you can't really compress it. It's not going to do anything too much to change that.
A side effect of distortion is that the signal is getting compressed as well.
Yeah. Not really, no.
When making a kick, almost all channels are clipping. So you need to lower the gain.
Well, actually, you can't see it here because the resolution is pretty tiny, but right at the end of this chain, I have this bit crusher. Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Well, can you say it again and I'll repeat it?
When making a kick, all of my channels are clipping more than 60 dB.
Mm-hmm.
So I almost always lower the gain of the channels.
Yeah.
So it won't happen. Is it necessary, or do you have to let it click?
No, it's necessary. To repeat the question, basically we're saying when he distorts, it clips, it goes over like 6 decibels here on the mixer, and he wants to know, like, is it good to turn it down or not? I guess, like, I do that as well. Like, I pull it down, and that's something that we call gain structure. When you're pulling things down in the mixer, things a little bit, you've got more control over the input and stuff. Yes, I pull it down, and like I try to make sure that my chain here is not clipping at all. So even over there, oh, this is the sample kick, but even later on, I make sure that it's not clipping because it's not going to sound good like that. It's different when you're clipping a signal with a distortion unit, and different to when your actual software sequencer is clipping as well. That's a different kind of clipping. That's a digital clipping, and it doesn't sound so good. But I find if you sort of like on a distortion unit pull down the output gain, or pull down it on the mixer itself, yeah, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of in a way making room to distort a little bit more.
When you lower the gain, my kick always is very soft volume.
Well,
Tip to merge it for the big lead.
sure, okay. The question is, when he pulls down the gain, the kick sounds really soft in volume compared to everything else. Well, to be honest, what I do is like once I have my kick finished, I have it actually sitting at about -9 on my mixer. So there's plenty of headroom, and it just sounds like it's a balance thing that the leads might be a little bit too loud. Just pull them down, dude. Like it doesn't necessarily matter if something is at a particular level because we're working in the digital world, I would assume. So if you just kind of like pull everything else down and let the kick sort of stay, where it sounds good, turn your speakers, your monitors up loud, so that things kind of stay in balance and feel right to you, that will help. When I used to use Fruity Loops, I found that it had a built-in limiter, and you sort of, the way that the structure of the mixer is a little bit funny because you need to assign everything to different like outputs and stuff. It's not quite as like in your face, pretending to be an analog mixer like Logic or Ableton or Cubase. And so the gain structure is really weird. I found if you use Fruity Loops, I'm not saying that you do, but it's a common thing I found with people that do use Fruity Loops. Like, yeah, my kick is really quiet. Why can't I turn it up? It's going to start clipping. Pull everything else down, and that'll give you the headroom that you need to stop clipping. That's the easy answer. Yep.
Does it matter how long the tail is?
Okay.
Does it change the character?
Yes and no. Like, if your tail of the kick is shorter, you're going to get a completely different feeling. It's going to be more stompy. It's going to be more aggressive. If your tail is longer, it's going to sound more open. It's going to sound a little bit more like a tone. So if you're playing, say, for instance, in Drumazon and turn down the decay, that is going to give you a different feeling. That's a creative use, though. That's not necessarily like, okay, kick needs to be in a particular way. That's more creative. Like if you listen to, let's say, for instance, this one from the picture. We'll take the EQ off. There isn't actually that much of like a tail to it. It's more open, and the rest of it is kind of reverb. Yeah, so it doesn't really, that's a creative thing. So if you feel that it sounds better and it's a really short decay, more power to you, man. If it needs to be longer, hey, cool. That sounds awesome too. Way up the back. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's something that I found with Drumazon. Like the actual point, like in the middle where it is not. I mean, it sounds a little bit like a G sharp, but it's actually G sharp and 23% higher. And that's just something with Drumazon. Maybe that's modeled from the original 909 or something. And that's one of the reasons why I use Tremor, which for some reason is not. I'm going to go install the pirated version. That's what I'm going to do. But Tremor allows you to get precise note values. But what you can do is when you start hearing it doesn't sound like it's in key and you're distorting, just try and bring it down and tweak it, through the process before you bounce that down to a WAV file and import it into your project. Because it's really hard to hear it by itself. But when you start distorting it, then you get a better idea of how it sounds and then tweak it further. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's not necessarily because of the distortion. It's more because you said you're using Very Audio there. Very Audio isn't... Yeah, no, I use Cubase as well. So Very Audio sometimes just doesn't get it right. It doesn't say, yeah, it's in there. And that's more of a fault of Very Audio. Use your ears when you can, if you're using on 909 to distort, and put up like a sine tone that's kind of like, where you want it to be, and then just use your ears to match it up. That's the best way to do it. Yeah, down the front.
I have a question regarding the same subject.
Right.
You said you used the D for the kick, but do you use it every time? Like a G or a G sharp?
No, and I'll tell you a little bit. Like I'll show you on this PowerPoint presentation.
In the meantime, let me say that using the G is pretty normal in a lot of genres. Like it's in hip hop and techno. Somehow the bass in a G tone, that's 49 hertz, seems to work on a lot of systems. It works on big systems in the clubs. And if you're on a laptop, you'll hear the first over
Yeah.
G. If you work around C, then in some systems your low will just fall off.
Yeah.
So it's always a good choice, whatever genre you work with.
But how do you fit your melodies to it? Because if you use the same G note for your kick,
Well, once it's bounced down and I've loaded it up into my project, like I can just work around that. And then the whole idea is like when you have a kick and you're distorting it at, say, for instance, G, and it sounds fantastic there, once you've bounced that down, you can keep that characteristic. It's bounced down. The distortion isn't going to change if you pitch that kick up or down or whatever to try and make that fit with your melody. It'll get a slightly different feeling, you know, when it's down lower in, say, F or F sharp, it'll feel a little bit more aggressive. If it's up higher in a B or an A, or even in a C, it's going to sound, you know, super, super happy. But I guess, yeah, like I start working and distorting at around a G or an F sharp or G sharp or whatever, depending on my mood. And then once I take that into a project, I'll then further resample that. I'll cut the tail off and then just pitch that up. So that way, yeah. Okay.
using contact, and then you leave the punch the same, and
Yeah.
then it moves the tail.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll talk about when we get back. Yeah, no worries. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. No, we go break.
Okay, no worries. Yeah?
Do you eventually do something to widen the kick, or do you keep it mono?
No, kick should be mono, always. If you're feeling particularly fancy, you could probably, you know, because we put reverb on there, and reverb will give you a big stereo spread. Above maybe 300 hertz, you can kind of leave that stereo, and you can achieve that with a couple of different ways of doing things. You can, you know, split the kick. So, like, say for instance, you're done, you bounce it down, load it up into one channel, and then mono-wise like the bass after filtering that off or something. But look, the majority of where this music is played is on club systems and festival systems, and the bass in those systems is in mono, and that's a good thing because that's, you know, that's how it should go. But yeah, like if your kick is not, you know, it's going to phase a little bit, it's going to be a little bit strange, and it's not going to have the same power or effect that it will do. So yeah, look, I think under 350, definitely keep it mono. If you're feeling brave, leave it stereo, but no one else. There's like not many people do that, you know what I mean? So yeah, in mono. For a safe bet, let's keep it in mono. All right, take a break.